Hello and welcome to this video on Othello by Shakespeare. This is the fifth video in the series, so I would advise you to watch the others first to get a bit of background on the text. I'm going to assume that you know who the characters are and generally what happens in the play. So as I say, those earlier videos will help you with that. Make sure you're taking notes as you're watching this video as well. So we're finally into the text of the play after lots of time looking at the historical context in the background. And what we need to remember with every scene is the big question behind each scene, or the big concepts, the big ideas that Shakespeare is trying to communicate. And I've put these two pictures on here to illustrate how we need to be looking at the play. So we need to see this kind of bigger picture, the questions about society, about the role of women in society, about racism in society, about how power can be used responsibly by the leader of the country and so on. So those are the big questions represented there by that kind of landscape view of Lindisfarne. And then in order to support our answers to those big questions, we need to look really closely at the smaller details, and we need to zoom in on the text. And we should always be oscillating, be moving between the bigger picture and those finer details. So the question I want to look at today, and I'm going to make sure this is on every slide, is how and why does Shakespeare introduce the theme of conflict from the outset of the play? Because this really dominates Act 1, Scene 1 and continues through the rest of the play. And it's one of the aspects of tragedy that we have to look at on this course. So Act 1, Scene 1 begins with Roderigo and Iago entering the stage, and they lament Cassio's promotion. So Roderigo says, "Tush, never tell me, I take it much unkindly, that thou, Iago, who hast had my purse as if the strings were thine, shouldst know of this." So Roderigo comes on stage and his first word is a mild swear word, and then he says that Iago has had my purse. Iago somehow controls Roderigo's money and uses Roderigo's money. So it's the first sign that Iago is quite a deceptive, manipulative character. So then Iago responds, "Splud, but you'll not hear me. If ever I did dream of such a matter, abhor me. Roderigo, thou toldst me thou didst hold him in thy head." So it's not entirely clear to the audience at this stage that they're talking about Othello, but they're having a conversation about loyalty. So we guess that before this scene starts, that Iago has told Roderigo that Othello and Desdemona have eloped. They've got married without anybody knowing. And Roderigo's accusing Iago of being two-faced. He says, "Thou told me thou did hold him in thy hate. You told me that you hated Othello, so why have you somehow helped with the marriage?" So, I mean, Roderigo's really put his finger on the main idea here, that Iago is duplicitous. He does deceive people. And then Iago tries to explain himself to Roderigo. He needs Roderigo in the play. So he says, "Despise me if I do not. I do hate Othello," is what he says. "Three great ones of the city, in personal suit to make me his lieutenant, off-capped to him. By the faith of man, I know my price. I am worth no worse a place." So here, Iago is talking about a promotion that's been going recently, and Othello has been able to make the decision of who to promote to the job of lieutenant in the army. And what Iago says is three great ones. So three really important people in the city have gone to Othello and said, "Iago is the best man for the job, you should give it to him." And Iago says, "I know my price, I am worth no worse a place," as in, I'm good enough to do this job. He continues then, "But he, as loving his own pride and purposes, evades them, with a bombast circumstance, horribly stuffed with epithets of war, and in conclusion none suits my mediators. For certes, he says, I have already chose my officer." So even though Iago has asked these very important people to try and persuade Othello to promote Iago, Othello's already made his choice. And Iago is really not happy with the choice that Othello's made. So he says, "What was he? Forsooth, a great arithmetician, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine, a fellow almost damned in a fair wife, that never set a squadron in the field, nor division of a battle knows, more than a spinster. Unless the bookish Theoric, wherein the togged counsels can propose as masterly as he, Mere prattle without practice is all his soldiership. I'm sure lots of us have experienced this kind of frustration in life, and it's quite funny really to see Iago complaining about this on the stage. His problem with Cassio is this idea of mere prattle without practice. Just talk. He says Cassio's all talk about what he can do, and he's never practiced it. He's never shown us on the battlefield that he is capable of all of these things that he says he can do. So Iago's really quite annoyed, and he says Cassio's trying to talk himself up to get himself into this job. And Iago is left as his moorship's ancient, so his ensign, his kind of servant in the army, rather than being able to command people like the lieutenant would be able to do. And Roderigo says, I would rather have been his hangman. I would rather have hung Othello than worked for him. And then Iago says, why, there's no remedy, 'tis the curse of service. Preferment goes by letter and affection, and not by old gradation. So here, Iago, it's quite odd, because earlier in the scene, Iago has said that he's asked other people to try and convince Othello to promote him, but here at the end of this slide Iago says that he's annoyed because Cassio has only been promoted because other people have sent letters for him. So Iago's contradicting himself here a little bit. And if we look a little bit more closely at this, the first word of the play, as I've said, is a mild kind of curse word. So Roderigo says tush and Iago says blood. So this is instantly introducing the idea that these characters are kind of angry, they're conflicted, they're going to be involved in the conflict of the play, and that there's going to be quite a lot of debased behaviour in the play. And then if we look here, there's lots of references kind of seeded into Othello, but we don't actually hear anything about who Othello is, and none of this is explained yet. And Shakespeare often does this at the start of a play. If you think of Macbeth, Macbeth is talked about in Act 1, Scene 1, he's talked about a little bit more clearly in Act 1, Scene 2, but we don't actually see him until Act 1, Scene 3. And it's very similar here. Roderigo and Iago, when they say him and his, they're talking about Othello here. And it's quite noticeable in Act 1, Scene 1 that they don't give him a name. And this is part of the racism of the play, the fact that they reduce Othello to just a pronoun or just to his ethnicity. You can see there on the screen, they talk about Othello as being his moorship. And that's quite a mocking way of referring to the captain of the army. Is referring to him by his ethnicity, and by adding that ship on the end of it creates a kind of mocking tone. And Iago says that Othello is full of pride and his own purposes. So we get this picture of a corrupted general in the army, someone who's not very much liked by the people who are supposed to be loyal to him. So Shakespeare's building up a picture here of quite an unlikable character. And then when we meet Othello in Act 1, Scene 2, Shakespeare destroys that, because actually Othello is a likeable character. He's a very sympathetic character at the start of the play. So looking here at Cassio then, Iago complains that Cassio is an arithmetician, that he's a Florentine, he never set a squadron in the field, and he's little more than a spinster. So that idea of arithmetician and never setting a squadron in the field show that Iago sees Cassio as an academic, as someone who's intellectually quite accomplished, but who doesn't actually have any practical understanding of how to run a battle. And he talks about him as being a Florentine as well, which is really interesting, because the start of the play is set in Venice, and what we learn very quickly is that Iago doesn't like people who he regards as being outsiders in Venetian society. It's not just Othello that Iago hates due to Iago's racism. He hates Cassio as well, and one of the reasons for this is that he comes from a different city. He comes from Florence, also in the north of Italy, but a competing republic to Venice. And so we get to see here that, yes, Iago is a racist character, but because of his attitude towards Othello, but actually it's more than that. He just doesn't like anyone who's different from him. And then when Iago complains that Cassio doesn't know battle any more than a spinster does. Now, a spinster is probably an older, unmarried woman. And we get a sense here of Iagos' misogyny as well, of his very negative, kind of hateful attitude towards women. So we have an impression of a character who's very misanthropic, who really doesn't like other people, has lots of problems with society. And in Act 1, Scene 1, it's almost funny, and that's going to become darker as the play progresses. But we do get this idea of conflict here, Iago conflicting with other characters because they are different from him. And then at the end there, Iago says there's no remedy, there's no way to fix this problem of Cassio's promotion and the fact that I haven't been promoted. And it's interesting that he says this because it seems that Iago doesn't really have a plan at this stage of the play. That plan's going to come later at the end of Act 1. So some vocabulary that we need to know to talk about Act 1, Scene 1. Firstly, the word resentful. So feeling angry and frustrated because you have been forced to accept something you don't like. Iago is resentful towards Cassio because Cassio has been promoted. Iago is resentful towards Othello because he believes that due to Othello's race that he shouldn't be in this position of power within the army. The word professional jealousy is very important throughout the play as well, and that's feeling jealous of someone else because of their success in their employment. Iago has professional jealousy towards Cassio because of his promotion. Meritocracy as well is also very important, and a meritocracy is a society in which people are promoted because of their ability and achievements rather than because they know the right people. So if you break down that word meritocracy into its different sections, merit is something that you do well. So if you get a certificate for a music exam, for example, you might get a merit as your grade, or at some schools you get merit awards or stamps in your planner, things like that. So merit is to do with something you've done well. And ocracy is to do with a way of organising society. So it's a way of organising society based on what people's accomplishments are, what they're able to do well. And in lots of ways, Othello has been the beneficiary of living in a society which is similar to a meritocracy. Othello has been promoted through the ranks in the army because he's good at what he does. A dupe as well is an important word. So Roderigo is the dupe in this scene. He's the character who's deceived and manipulated by another. And Roderigo is a very comic character at the start of the play. He says silly things, he follows Iago, he just completely believes everything that Iago tells him. And it's so clear that Iago is manipulating him that creates a lot of humour and a lot of comedy. And often Roderigo is played in quite a slapstick way as well. Now, this actually foreshadows the darker scenes that are going to come later in the play. The fact that Iago manipulates Roderigo at the start foreshadows what he's going to do with Othello, how convincingly he's going to manipulate Othello later in the play. Looking a little bit later in the scene then, we have this speech from Iago, and he's trying to explain to Roderigo why he hates Othello, but he's still pretending to be loyal to Othello. And so here we learn that Iago is absolutely deceiving Othello, that he does hate him, he does resent him, he does have this professional jealousy towards him, yet he's going to pretend to be honest and loyal towards him. So let's have a read of this. I follow him to serve my turn upon him. We cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. You shall mark many a duteous and knee-crooking knave that, doting on his own obsequious bondage, wears out his time much like his master's ass, for naught but provender, and, when he's old, cashiered. Whip me such honest knaves. Okay, so this first section here could have been quite controversial at the time. Shakespeare could have been interpreted as satirising, as mocking, as talking about the political court of King James. And he says, we cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. So Iago here is questioning the whole social system. How are you going to decide whether you should follow your master or not? What are the criteria that you should use to decide whether you should be loyal to your master or whether you should betray him? And of course, from studying Macbeth, we know that the gunpowder plot showed that some people were prepared to question King James's leadership and were prepared to say, well, King James isn't the same branch of Christianity as us. He's not treating Catholics in the way that he should, and based on that criteria, we should get rid of him. And so this kind of statement from Iago could have been interpreted as being quite controversial for the audience. But as I say, there's quite a lot of comedy in this opening scene, so that would have diffused some of the kind of more complex interpretations of that statement. And Iago here talks about many a duteous and knee-crooking knave. Now, knee-crooking means someone who's going to kneel down before his king or his queen or his leader or whatever. And knave is is just a reference to a man, a servant. So these people who kneel down before their leaders in obsequious, so obsequious basically means sucking up to someone. So these obsequious people follow their leaders, and then at the end of it, they are given their provender, their food, so they're provided for when they serve their leader, but when they're too old, they're kind of gotten rid of. And Iago says he doesn't want that to happen to him. He says there are others who do well thrive by them, and when they have lined their coats, do themselves homage. These fellows have some soul, and such a one do I profess myself. Now, to line your own coat suggests that you would be exploiting your employment. You might be taking a bit more than you should, you might be manipulating the situation, and instead of kind of serving your leader, your master, your king or your queen or whoever it is, and helping them, you're actually improving your own social situation. So that image of lining the coat has kind of come in to common speech as a way of looking after yourself, really, rather than being too concerned about other people. And Iago says, such a one do I profess myself. That's me. I'm like that. I am not this silly knee-crooking knave who's prepared to bow down before a leader and give everything to them. I'm the kind of person who's going to line my own coat. I'm going to keep everything for myself. And then he finishes this section saying, were I the Moor, I would not be Iago, and following him, I follow but myself. So I'm going to get what I can out of this relationship. So these two lines here, serve my turn upon him, and that one I just read, and following him I follow but myself, show Iago's duplicity, his selfishness, the fact that he's going to kind of serve himself and line his own pockets. And there's a really nice balance to these final couple of lines. In following him I follow but myself. You know, that almost chiastic structure shows that Iago is kind of focusing in on himself rather than opening up his ideas to other people. And there's an interesting reflection on identity as well here. Iago says, were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. So if I followed the Moor, I couldn't be myself. And there's this idea of the servant needing to have his own identity, his own individuality. And again, that concept might have been a little bit strange to the audience. You know, a servant would have dressed in the colours of their master, they would have served them completely. Everything that they did would have been to improve the situation that their master was in. But Iago sees a contradiction there, and he says, actually, if I were to do that, if I were to follow the Moor completely, I would lose my own individuality. And then at the end he says, I am not what I am. Now this is a really, really famous quotation, and if you remember nothing else from this video, remember this quotation. Now in the Bible, in the Old Testament, God gives a statement, I am, in response to Moses. When Moses says, who are you? And God just says, I am. And that present tense verb am suggests that God has continued before Moses was alive, he continues after, he's eternal, and he's always the same. Now here Iago alludes to that, he refers to that Old Testament quotation, but he changes it, and the audience would have recognised the reference to the Bible, and then would have seen that if Iago's kind of taking that and changing it and twisting it, it's almost quite blasphemous, it's quite profane, and signals to the audience just how evil Iago might be prepared to be. He says, I am not what I am. So he's appearing to be one thing, You know, God appeared to be very good, benevolent, eternal, and that is absolutely true within the context of the Bible. But what Iago is saying, actually, I'm pretending to be like that, I'm pretending to be honest and benevolent, but I'm not that. I'm actually going to deceive the people around me. But it's that allusion to the Bible which hints through the comedy of the first scene that actually Iago is quite a malevolent character, and that this is going to be a tragic play. And then Roderigo and Iago turn their attention to the job that they need to do in this scene. So they've met in the street so that they can go and waken up Brabantio, Desdemona's father, and tell Brabantio that Desdemona and Othello have eloped together. So Iago says, call up her father, rouse him, make after him, poison his delight, proclaim him in the streets, incense her kinsmen, and, though he in a fertile climate dwell, plague him with flies. Though that his joy be joy, yet throw some changes of vexation on it, as it may lose some colour. So he's trying to rile Roderigo up. He's saying, come on, let's wake up Brabantio, let's ruin his life. Basically, let's destroy all of his happiness by telling them that his daughter has eloped with Othello. Roderigo's much more calm and much more practical. He says, here is her father's house, I'll call aloud. And there's quite a contrast there between what Iago says, the emotion behind it, and Roderigo's quite factual statement. So Iago says, do, with like timorous accent and dire yell, as when by night and negligence the fire is spied in populous cities. So come on, let's wake him up. Roderigo says, what ho, Brabantio, senior Brabantio, ho. It's quite funny because Roderigo does what Iago tells him, but he's being very polite about it. You know, senior Brabantio, he's giving Brabantio his title, and using his name in a very polite fashion. And then Iago doesn't adopt quite such a polite attitude to this. He says, awake, what ho, Brabantio, thieves, 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 look to your house, your daughter and your bags, thieves, thieves. So Iago here is deliberately trying to create emotion in Roderigo and Brabantio at this point of the play. And if we look at the opening section of this, the words that Iago chooses are really important. And these words are resigned throughout the rest of the play. So we see lots of references in the play to poison and also to plague as well. Now, poison, well, we've seen it being used in Hamlet to kill other people, and so we've got this idea that it's quite destructive, it's kind of an ultimate cause of death, and then the idea of plague again is a biblical allusion to a horrific situation that's going to absolutely destroy somebody's happiness. And poison and plague can also spread quite easily. You know, a plague cannot be contained. So Iago here is unleashing a sense of chaos, disorder, destruction that's going to then ripple out through the rest of society. And it's interesting here that Roderigo says, I'll call aloud. And Iago says, do, yeah, go on, you do it. And what we see is something that happens throughout the rest of the play as well, is that Iago gets other people to do his dirty work for him. So Iago's kind of pushed Roderigo into this situation. Go on, you call, you wake him up, you do it. And later on in the play, he does exactly the same thing. Go on, you stab Cassio, you do it. I'll just stand by and watch and, you know, be the moral support in this situation. And Iago quite enjoys watching other people follow his instructions. You know, he's very manipulative and almost a little bit sadistic in some senses. So, to kind of summarise, to consolidate your understanding of this scene, I've got an independent learning task for you. And because what we're focusing on for the AQA course is this play in relation to the aspects of tragedy, I would like you to complete this table. So you've got aspects of tragedy down the side, find your evidence from the section of the text that we've read, and then think, how do these ideas connect to the big question, which is how and why does Shakespeare introduce the theme of conflict from the outset of the play? You know, it is a tragedy. Conflict is central to the idea of tragedy, and there's lots of different types of conflict in this scene. So we've got conflict, social conflict between different classes, so between Iago and Cassio. We've got conflict to do with race, so between Iago, Roderigo and Othello, and also to do with gender as well, so conflict between Iago and the way he perceives women in the play too. So thank you very much for listening, and the next video is going to be on the second part of Act 1, Scene 1.